Imagine being in Scotland in the year 1332 when the Battle of Dupplin Moor took place in Perthshire. Two mismatched armies were gearing up for a fight: the larger Scottish force, commanded by Earl Domnall of Mar, and the smaller but determined coalition of Anglo-Scottish nobles known as the Disinherited. The battle was a struggle of reclaiming lost lands and titles. At the helm of the Disinherited were Edward Balliol and Henry de Beaumont, two men driven by their past and ambitions. Picture this: the Disinherited with a formidable army of 1,500 men, including archers, men-at-arms, and German knights ready to fight. The Scottish army, though tenfold in size, was not as organized or well-equipped. Despite the numbers, when the battle commenced, it quickly turned into a disaster for the Scottish. Many soldiers were crushed by their own troops in the mayhem, and Scottish nobles, including Earl Domnall and Robert Bruce, fell. Edward Balliol's victory at Dupplin Moor marked an unexpected turn in the quest for the Scottish throne. Many flocked to join Balliol's court, and he took over Perth without resistance. It was a significant victory for the Disinherited, but the war for Scotland was far from over. The most astonishing fact about this battle, however, is... well, let's hold on to that for now. What's up, my amazing and curious folks? Ready to unravel mysteries together? I'm your host, Chaser, and with me is the ever-insightful Sonia Guimaraes.
Hi folks, excited to be here.
We're all set to take you on another fascinating journey on Curiosity Wonderland. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to stay updated with all our episodes. Buckle up, because today we've got an intriguing tale from the pages of history that you won't want to miss. The Battle of Dupplin Moor was truly an event that shook the foundations of history. According to the Lanarkhost Chronicle, the pile of the dead was greater in height from the ground to the sky than one whole spear length. Reflect on that for a moment, folks. On the northern bank of the River Erne in Perthshire, there stood a Scottish army of Bruce loyalists. These men were led by the Guardian of Scotland himself, Earl Domnall.
Wait, wasn't Earl Domnall appointed to his position just days before the battle took place, and he was ruling in the name of the child king, David II, right?
That's correct. Interesting point. Surrounding him were the leading figures of Scottish nobility, including Earl Muriedhach, Stewart of Menteith, Earl Thomas Randolph of Moray, and Earl Donshad of Fife, among others. Also present was Lord Robert Bruce of Liddesdale, illegitimate son of the late king. Now, on the other side of the river, it was a different story. The southern counterpart was a makeshift army of household retainers and mercenaries from the north of England. This was the army of the Disinherited, a coalition of Anglo-Scottish nobles whose ancestors had been exiled from Scotland and had their lands seized a generation ago. They were led by Edward Balliol and Henry de Beaumont, and their goal was to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs.
So, Edward Balliol was the eldest surviving son of the deposed King John I of Scotland. He had a claim to the Scottish throne, right? And I believe King John I had come to power when Edward I of England arbitrated the succession dispute.
You are absolutely right. Edward Balliol was born in 1283. His father, King John I, had come to the Scottish throne in 1292 when Edward I of England intervened following the death of Alexander III. Edward I ruled that John's claim to the throne was stronger than that of his Bruce rivals. However, Edward I also tried to enforce the acknowledgement of his claim that as King of England, he was the feudal overlord of the entire British Isles, including Scotland. And this, my curious friends, was the beginning of a fierce and bloody battle. Now let's step back to the year of 1296. John, who had proven himself incapable of standing up to Edward, observed as the Council of Guardians, ruling in his name, invaded England. This was in protest against Edward's attempts to summon the Scottish king to an English law court. Unfortunately for King John, the war ended with a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Dunbar, leading to his imprisonment and forced abdication. Despite this setback, a succession of guardians, including the famed William Wallace, continued to fight for Scottish independence in the Balliol name. This continued until the year 1306. Robert Bruce, the former adherent of the English king, and the grandson of John's rival, took advantage of the Baliol's continued absence and their guardian's lack of success to advance his own alternate claim to the throne.
And as Robert's dual campaign to secure the Scottish throne and drive out the English gained success, Baliol's former allies and supporters were forced one by one to either swear loyalty to Bruce or to throw their lot in with their former English opponents, right?
Yes, indeed. Now let's talk about Edward Balliol, the 49-year-old son of the deposed King John. He had spent half his life waiting for a chance to reclaim his father's throne. There was another prominent leader amongst the disinherited who caught my attention. His name was Henry de Beaumont, a French-born adventurer and soldier. Henry had gained prominence within the English court because of his tireless participation in Edward I's many military campaigns. He was also a close friend of the future Edward II.
And wasn't Henry married to Alice Comyn, the niece and rightful heir of Earl John Comyn of Buchan? They were one of the most powerful and politically influential families in Scotland at the time, right?
You hit the nail on the head. The Comyns were close allies and relatives of the Balliols, and they enjoyed close political ties with both Alexander II and Alexander III. However, it is notable to mention that the political establishment that the Comyns represented was disrupted by the outbreak of war. But their course changed dramatically when John Comyn the Red, the Lord of Badenoch, was murdered by Robert Bruce and his supporters during a meeting in 1406. We are just scratching the surface of this complex history, folks. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the causes and outcomes of the Battle of Dupplin Moor. Following the murder of John Comyn the Red, the entire Comyn family sided with the English kings in a desperate bid to defeat Bruce, who was now openly calling himself the King of Scotland. Unfortunately for them, Edward I passed away in 1307, leaving the unprepared Edward II to deal with the pressing issues of his reign.
And Edward II wasn't exactly the most popular figure, was he, Caesar? From what I understand, he was known for his mismanagement of the nobility and emerging unpopularity.
You're right, Sonia. With the threat of his English enemies reduced, Robert Bruce turned his attention towards his isolated Scottish rivals. Until the end of 1308, he and his allies systematically weakened the power base of the Comyns, defeating them in battle and ravaging their earldom of Buchan. The defeated Earl John fled to England, where he passed away shortly after, leaving his empty title to his niece and her husband, Henry de Beaumont. Henry had a strong familiarity with the wars in Scotland, having participated in both the English victory at Falkirk under Edward I and the disastrous Bannockburn under Edward II. Determined to reclaim his wife's lost earldom, Henry stayed loyal to Edward II throughout the many crises of his reign until Edward began to contemplate peace with Scotland.
Wait, didn't he then shift his allegiances to Edward's rebel wife, Isabella, and her partner Roger Mortimer? And when they also aimed for peace with Scotland, Henry attempted to rise against them, didn't he?
Spot on, Sonia. And astonishingly, this audacious move worked out for Henry and his fellow disinherited when the young Edward III removed his regents from power and allowed Henry to return from exile. And this, dear listeners, sets the stage for more exciting events to come in the saga of the Battle of Dupplin Moor. Stay tuned as we continue to go deeper into the story. Let's set the stage here. Edward III had forbidden the disinherited from directly invading Scotland from English soil. But after negotiations with Henry de Beaumont, he allowed them to undertake a seaborne invasion.
So basically, instead of risking a violation of the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, they planned to arrive as anonymous outlaws from the sea?
Exactly. It was a political move, one that, despite its cunning, seemed at odds with Edward's other actions. For example, the king's trusted knight, Walter Muni, accompanied the disinherited, likely as Edward's informant.
And Edward III knew about their plans all along, didn't he?
Indeed. In fact, he granted Henry de Beaumont the princely sum of £500 and allowed several disinherited to lease their estates. This gave them a way to raise much-needed cash for the war effort.
Money is always the key, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And with these resources, the disinherited were able to raise a force of about 1,500 men, a modest but significant number.
And didn't most of those soldiers come from the lower classes of English society?
That's right. Around 1,000 of them were archers, which was interesting because at the time the bow was largely being replaced by the crossbow across Europe. However, the English, possibly influenced by their Welsh neighbors, still valued the bow as a weapon of war.
So were they ready for the battle?
They were gearing up, yes. We're about to delve into the thick of the Battle of Dupplin Moor. Stay with us, listeners, as we continue to unravel this fascinating bit of history. Let's dive into the composition of the disinherited's army. Back in 1252, Henry III published an Assize of Arms, a decree outlining the terms of military service for each Englishman. The bow was identified as the base level of armament an Englishman was expected to bring.
And archers had been a crucial part of English armies during Edward I's and Edward II's war for overlordship of Scotland, right?
Yes, that's right. Archers could be deadly in the right circumstances, but they needed proper deployment. They proved decisive in the Battle of Falkirk under Edward I, but at Bannockburn under Edward II, their effectiveness was significantly reduced.
So it wasn't just about having archers, it was about how they were used in battle.
Exactly. Now, the second component of the army was the 500 men-at-arms. They were the elite fighters of the army, equipped with plate armor, helms, and various weapons. The core of the disinherited's men-at-arms consisted of the retainers and vassals of the army's leaders, along with adventurers and mercenaries seeking to profit from the war.
They were a diverse group, weren't they?
Yes, they were. Many probably came from the north of England, involved in the long-standing raid war across the Anglo-Scottish border. Others came from places as far as Germany and the lowlands. These men, the inheritors of the traditional knightly class and mode of warfare, typically preferred to fight from horseback.
So they did carry horses with them?
Yes, horses were crucial for transport, long marches, and launching raids. But given the seaborne nature of the invasion and the financial limitations, it's possible the disinherited's army had fewer horses than usual. The unfolding of the Battle of Dupplin Moor will reveal more about their strategy. Stay tuned as we dive deeper. Now, this is where things start to heat up. The disinherited, despite their small numbers, were gearing up. They assembled their forces and gathered the necessary supplies and naval assets to transport them to Scotland. This was all done under a thin veil of deniability.
So everyone knew, but no one acknowledged it officially?
Exactly. Meanwhile, in Scotland, the Guardian, Thomas Randolph, was rallying his own forces. Sadly, the pressure of these efforts likely worsened his existing illness, leading to his death on the 20th of July, 1332.
That's a blow to Scotland's preparations.
It certainly was. Yet just 11 days later, the disinherited sailed to Scotland in a makeshift fleet of 88 vessels. They landed at the port of Kinghorn on the 6th of August and won a minor skirmish against Scottish levies led by the Earl of Fife.
You know, this reminds me of a time when I was visiting a historical site. The guide was describing the preparation and mobilization efforts of armies in a similar situation. It's incredible what they accomplished with the resources they had.
Absolutely. It's interesting how history often mirrors itself. Now, getting back to our story, after landing successfully, the disinherited raided the cache of war material the Scots had gathered at Dunfermline. Then they headed north for Perth and Scone, the sacred coronation site of Scottish kings.
Seems like a symbolic choice.
Indeed, it was. But the disinherited didn't have an easy path. They encountered the forces of Earl Domnall, a maternal nephew of King Robert, who had been raised in luxurious captivity in England. Interestingly, his loyalties were personal rather than cultural, having fought against his Scottish relatives for Edward's cause.
It's fascinating how personal loyalties can shape historical events. Just like that guide I mentioned earlier, he said that understanding the personal relationships at play often reveals more about the events than any formal historical record.
That's a great point. Personal motivations often drive history far more than we might think. Now let's continue this remarkable journey of the disinherited and their quest to recapture a kingdom. As we move forward with our story, Earl Domnall, after commanding a wing of the Scottish army during the Battle of Stanhope Park, was elected Guardian. He was seen as a compromise candidate, backed by a significant part of the aristocracy that wasn't particularly closely aligned with the Bruce dynasty, and who wanted to avoid a protracted war with the disinherited or their English backers.
Politics always playing a role, even in warfare.
Indeed. However, others doubted Domnall's loyalty to King David, but faced with the task of repelling the disinherited's invasion, he came up with a simple but effective plan. He split the Scottish forces into two distinct armies, both north and south of the Firth of Forth, ready to confront the disinherited wherever they landed.
I'm reminded of a chess tournament I attended where a player used a similar strategy, positioning his pieces to counter any move his opponent made.
A great analogy indeed. In our historical chess game, Earl Patrick of Dunbar was appointed to command the force guarding the coast south of the Firth. Now this Earl Patrick was interesting. His father, also Patrick, had been one of the candidates for the throne of Scotland and had fought for Edward I against John Balliol and the Scottish Guardians.
Loyalty seems to be a complicated concept in this context.
For sure. Young Patrick maintained his allegiance to the English king and concept of English royal overlordship until Bannockburn. Let's see how his strategy played out in the face of the disinherited's invasion. So the Earl of Mar's army size, as suggested by historians, was estimated to be around 15,000 men. This sizable force greatly outnumbered the disinherited by a significant ratio of 10-1. The fact that the Scottish nobility could raise such an army amidst a leadership crisis highlights their ability to effectively coordinate and cooperate.
That's impressive. It makes me think of the time in high school when we had to organize a charity event. Our headmaster went on sudden leave, and we were left to our devices. Despite being just a bunch of teenagers, we pulled together, coordinated everything, and ended up raising a good amount of money.
That's a great story. And much like your high school event, the Scottish Army wasn't paid or fed for their service. Military recruitment operated on two principal forms at the time. One was a variant of the traditional feudal obligation, where an army of retinues was formed as members of the nobility mobilized their own military households and called upon their vassals and allies to do the same.
So it was more about loyalty and obligation to the cause than any monetary gains.
Yes, exactly. And this recruitment process did raise a significant number of well-equipped and trained soldiers, being the combined military households and immediate retainers of the participating aristocrats. It was less about strict quotas and more about negotiation and commitment.
It's kind of like when we used to organize neighborhood games when I was a kid. We didn't have any strict teams or numbers, but everyone pitched in and we ended up having some of the best games. It was all about commitment and wanting to be part of something big.
That's a perfect analogy. Let's see how this commitment and strategic planning played out in the face of the disinherited invasion. Now, another way to raise soldiers in Scotland was the tradition that in times of emergency, the Guardian could summon every able-bodied man in the kingdom to service. These musters were usually called on a regional level to support ongoing campaigns.
Like calling up the reserves when the main forces are stretched thin.
Yes, exactly. While these musters could raise formidable numbers, their usefulness was often limited by their lack of equipment and military training. Another issue was that they were expected to bring their own food, which was sufficient for only a few days.
Sounds like a real logistical nightmare.
It was. To mitigate some of these issues, Robert I even passed legislation in 1318 to impose standards of equipment that such men were supposed to bring with them. Rich men with a yearly income in excess of £10 were required to equip themselves in the manner of a man-at-arms. This included plate armor, an aceton, steel gauntlets, and a helmet.
That's quite a shopping list.
And the poor, those who owned property equivalent to the cash value of a cow or less, only had to bring a spear or a bow and 20 arrows. Yet it's unclear how effective these reforms were in practice. However, in times of crisis, Scottish commanders could call upon both methods of recruitment, resulting in large forces with a core of well-equipped and disciplined soldiers.
So quality and quantity all rolled into one.
That's right. This system, combined with the tactical lessons from the previous war, taught the Scots to fight primarily on foot. They organized their armies into large formations or schiltrons of tightly packed infantry armed with spears. This proved to be a formidable strategy, as seen in the Battle of Bannockburn. They neutralized the enemy's superiority in heavy cavalry with their tightly packed wall of spears and successfully hemmed in the English army.
And grinding it down, turning the tide of battle, a true testament to their strategy and resolve.
With his superior numbers, Mar was confident of victory. However, the Erne proved to be a considerable obstacle for his forces. Instead of forcing a crossing amid enemy archers, Mar planned to dispatch flanking forces the following day and envelop the small pro-Balliol army, a strategy to make effective use of his superior numbers.
A tactical move indeed, but as we know in war, the best-laid plans can often go awry.
Very true. As night fell, Mar sent for ale and wine from nearby Perth, which was distributed liberally among his troops, leading to an evening of carousing. The disinherited, however, aware of their precarious position, embarked upon a daring night march.
So while one side was partying, the other was plotting.
Exactly. Andrew Murray, a Scottish member of the disinherited, knew of an unguarded ford nearby, which allowed the entire disinherited army to cross over to the north bank of the Erne. There, in the darkness and confusion, they scattered a small number of Scots.
So the tables were turning.
It seemed so. But come dawn, the disinherited were soon to learn that the large Scottish army was not only intact, but rapidly closing in on them. Despite this, the disinherited wasted no time and took a strong defensive position at the bottom of a depression on the edge of Dupplin Moor.
Even when the odds are stacked against you, proper strategy and quick thinking can save the day.
Indeed. The disinherited arranged their men at arms in a thin line across this depression, while their archers positioned themselves on the slopes of two overlooking hills. They had to span the entire space between these two hills to prevent being outflanked. Now, let's see how this strategy played out as the Scottish army descended upon them. As the Scottish army approached, rivalries within their ranks became evident. Earl Domnall wanted to offer Balliol and Beaumont a chance to surrender, given they were so outnumbered. However, this angered Robert Bruce, his second in command.
A leadership clash right in the middle of a battlefield can't be ideal.
Certainly not. They both became determined to prove their loyalty and worthiness to lead by being the first to crush the disinherited. This led to a race across the moor, which caused their formations to become disorganized and deformed.
So they were more focused on outshining each other than on coordinating their attack effectively.
That's correct. The race was won by Robert Bruce, but his troops arrived out of formation and staggered towards the enemy. And as they did, the disinherited's men-at-arms, although pushed back, managed to keep their battle line intact.
And weren't there archers involved too?
Indeed, the English archers, positioned on the two hills on either side of the melee, began raining down arrows on Bruce's troops. This created a precarious situation for the Scottish forces.
So, while the Scottish were dealing with internal conflicts and disorganized attacks, the disinherited were maintaining their line and using their position to their advantage.
Exactly. It paints a vivid picture of how internal disputes and poor coordination can turn a potentially winning situation into a very precarious one. The plot thickens. Both Robert Bruce and Earl Domnall had placed their best equipped and trained troops at the front of their formations, intending to break through the disinherited army. However, this left the less well-armored, less disciplined troops exposed to the English archers.
So their front line was strong, but their flanks were vulnerable.
Precisely. As the disinherited's men held firm in the center, the archers whittled away at the less protected flanks. Panic ensued, leading to a dangerous crush that greatly impeded the combat effectiveness of the Scottish formation.
A chaotic scene as the initial confidence of the Scottish side gave way to sheer panic.
It was. The situation deteriorated further with the arrival of the second half of the Scottish army and the Earl of Mar's schiltron. Mar, seeing the ongoing battle, could have divided his command and attacked the archers directly. However, seemingly unaware of the danger Bruce's troops were in, he chose to throw the full weight of his forces into the melee.
That seems like a rash decision.
Indeed. Rather than achieving a swift and decisive victory, Mar's men only exacerbated the existing crush to a deadly level. It's a telling example of how ego and political ambition can cloud judgment on the battlefield. The situation spiraled further out of control as Mar's formation came under attack by archers. The crush between formations resulted in the death of perhaps as many as 1,000 of Mar's soldiers.
Sounds like a disastrous situation.
It was. The army was routed, leaving behind heaps of the dead. Among the casualties were Earl Domnall, Robert Bruce, and a number of Scottish barons. This was a significant blow to the Bruce-aligned leadership and their ability to wage a coordinated campaign of resistance against Edward Balliol.
And what was the impact on the Disinherited's side?
Remarkably, only 35 of the Disinherited's men at arms were killed. Their triumph over almost impossible odds led to rumors of divine favor for Edward Balliol's candidacy. As a result, large segments of the nobility and almost all of Scotland's bishops joined Edward's impromptu court.
So their improbable victory led to a significant increase in their followers.
Exactly. With Mar's army defeated, the Disinherited were able to occupy Perth without resistance and stage a hasty coronation for Edward Balliol. Although the war for control of Scotland was still far from over, the Battle of Dupplin Moor marked a significant turning point and a homecoming for the long-exiled lords of the Disinherited. The tale we've unraveled today is a riveting one, delving into medieval aristocratic culture and identity amidst battles and political machinations.
It's been a fascinating journey through time, shedding light on the power dynamics and strategic maneuvers of the era.
Indeed, the combination of fear, bravery, strategy, and hubris has painted a vivid picture of these historical figures and their determined struggle for power.
The stakes were high, lives were lost, and yet the will for power and control persevered.
A reminder that history is a continuous unfoldment of human ambition, courage, and sometimes calculated ruthlessness.
A great note to end on. But, of course, the war for control of Scotland was far from over. The story of these long-exiled lords and their homecoming will continue to echo through time.
And we'll be here to unravel more such tales and curiosities for all our listeners here on Curiosity Wonderland. What an incredible journey we've taken today, diving into the Battle of Dupplin Moor. We've discovered how Edward Balliol and Henry de Beaumont, leaders of the smaller and seemingly outmatched Disinherited forces, triumphed against the much larger Scottish army. Their cunning strategy and the power of their archers led to an unlikely victory, which many interpreted as a sign of divine favor. It's a vivid reminder that in history, the odds can always be defied.
Absolutely. It's a tale that weaves bravery, strategy, and a bit of divine intervention. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into a chapter of medieval history and that it offered some food for thought. If you liked this episode, don't forget to blast that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and share this episode with your friends.
We really appreciate you joining us today, listeners. Every episode of Curiosity Wonderland is a new adventure, and we're so glad you're here with us.
Yes, thank you all for being part of our community. We look forward to bringing you more curiosities and mysteries in our next episode. Until then, take care and keep exploring the world around you. Genergent, goodbye.
I found this intriguing tale on medievalist.net in an article titled The Battle of Dupplin Moor, authored by James Turner and published on April 13th, 2024. If you're interested in delving deeper into this subject, you'll find the full URL in the description. Now, I'm signing off.